Hello and welcome everyone to our next installment of the California Fire Science Seminar Series. My name is Michael Gollner from the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm pleased to be hosting the session today with our speaker, Tirtha Banerjee from the University of California, Irvine. Before we get started, I wanted to give a few announcements. First off, the way the seminar works, we'll have this 1-hour session with the seminar and question and answer. Please note there's no microphone or video for participants. Everything is handled with a question and answer. You'll see on the bottom of your screen if you logged into Zoom Q&A. So you can click on Q&A and post questions at any time throughout the talk, and we'll go through those questions in the order received at the end of the seminar series. We also have a discussion section held afterwards on a regular Zoom meeting where our videos and audio is unmuted, which is a time to get to know our speaker and for open questions, whether about the series or anything else. And we highly encourage early career attendees that are interested. That Zoom link was sent out by email and will also be shared during the presentation. Finally, we want to thank our sponsors, the Fire Research Group within the School of Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Merced, where Jeanette Kobian and Crystal Colden have helped co-host this seminar series. So I want to say thank you again to Tirtha Banerjee. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of California, Irvine. And he was previously a postdoc in Germany before moving to the United States and working at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's worked in wildfires, ecosystem disturbance, as well as wind energy resources. And while at Los Alamos National Lab, he was a Chick Keller postdoctoral fellow and a director's fellow. And so we're really pleased to have him here and to introduce the very interesting modeling and atmospheric scale dynamic side of the wildland fire problem. So thank you again for accepting our invitation. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. See, there are 112 people, so thanks for turning up. And so thanks for the kind introduction, Michael. As you can see here, the topic today is a micrometeorological perspective into wildland fire dynamics. And I like to start with this picture because it does show a few different interesting elements of wildfires that are happening in the atmospheric boundary layer, which as micrometeorologists, we study a lot. So as you can see here, there are trees burning, the flames are engulfing the trees, you have smoke coming up, you have a sort of a complex topography, you have different colors of smoke, and you have the atmosphere. So all fine and good, but there is a very interesting feature that is hidden inside this figure. So if you trace this line, it actually is the the curve of global average temperature from 1880s to now almost. So interesting figure. This is by Jill Pelto called Increasing Forest Fire Activity. I encourage you to check out more of Jill Pelto's artwork because there are also interesting art on climate change, ocean sea level rise, ice cap melting, etc., etc. All right, so thanks again, Michael, for the background. Just a quick note, I did my bachelor in civil engineering in India, and I have a PhD from Duke University in North Carolina. My dissertation topic was turbulent flow in natural environments. So I'm not a wildfire specialist by training. And my postdoctoral work in Germany, KIT, it was in the German Alps. It was to look at ecosystem atmosphere interaction. And then, and also when I came to Los Alamos, I started actually wildfire research. So currently I am at UCI. My lab is called the Boundary Layers and Turbulence Research Lab, the BLT, named after the famous sandwich. So, but yeah, it's Boundary Layers and Turbulence. This is the lab logo on the left-hand side. And here are my PhD students currently, Mukesh Kumar, Shuli, Margarita Rivera, Ajinkya Desai, and postdocs Janine Vaidnath Rodino and incoming postdoc Asad Morad. And in our lab, we do multi-scale, multi-fidelity modeling and some experiments of interfacial fluid mechanics. And turbulent flow is our main main bread and butter research, but that gave a segue into modeling disturbance and resilience of the built and natural environments. Here's like a QR code for my lab if you're interested to check out more of our papers, etc. Please scan it. And here's also a Twitter feed, Banerjee Lab on Twitter if you want to follow us. So just a very brief introduction on my lab's activities. Again, as I said, our turbulent flow is our main area of research. And wildfires, we started wildfire research as a theme of turbulence actually. But then we do study boundary layer meteorology in general. Here's a picture of wind turbines in the atmosphere. And we also study ecosystem atmosphere interaction. How does forested lands, also water bodies, how do they interact with the atmosphere? On the right-hand side, we have a map of, map of transpiration mapped on individual trees in a landscape. And as I mentioned, we do study wildfires. And also we do some experiments on how vegetation and the atmosphere and water bodies, how do they interact with each other. The reason I put this up here is just to provide the context from which we address the topic of wildfires. And as wildfire is one component, but not all of our lab. So here I have put up our main collaborators with whom we mostly work on wildfires. So I wouldn't name each names here because there are so many, but we're indebted to all of them. And so from UCI, UC Berkeley, UC Agricultural and Natural Resources, Riverside, we have collaborators from Los Alamos, obviously my previous network of collaborators at Los Alamos. And we also have active collaborations with the US Forest Service, Northern and Southern research stations. We have collaborations with Tall Timber Research Station out in Florida, and also Craig Clemens Group in San Jose State University. I do have multiple Twitter notifications chiming in, so I guess some folks are following up from the previous slide. So thanks for that. Okay, so I also want to acknowledge our funding sources. So we are majorly funded by UC Lab Fees program by the Office of the President, University of California, UCOP. We have some internal fundings, and also I'm a new faculty at UCI. It's been 1 year since I have been here. And so I acknowledge the startup fund from UCI and some internal funds on wildfires. We have some ongoing agreements with the US Forest Service and Los Alamos National Lab and the Tall Timbers Lab as well. Right, so coming back to micrometeorology and fire. So what aspects do we study? Here, some pictures, they do show the different aspects. So on the left-hand side, we can see fires moving up canopies, right? So you can see the flames. In some cases, they are engulfing the entire tree. In some cases, they are partially burning. In some cases, they are climbing up. So this is a problem in the canopy sublayer, as we call it in micrometeorology. And as if you're a fire manager, this is what you want to prevent, the crowning of the fire when the fire climbs up a canopy and becomes really high intensity. So on the right-hand side, again, these are mostly from the campfire in 2018. But you could actually have any of the recent fires, the mega fires as they call it. You have the same phenomena again and again. So this is not from a dystopian movie, but this was in San Francisco, and I think we also happened the same thing. We had the same thing in the last month again. There was really poor air quality. And so again, problem of crowning, the problem of air pollution from fires, the fact here that the fire can move up and down complex topography, and also on the left-hand side, we have pictures of embers, which are the burning particles that are essentially launched by the very gusty fire wind, and they can travel miles or kilometers. They can deposit on individual structures and cause home ignition. So all of these factors are happening close to the land surface in the atmospheric boundary layer. And with our modeling tools and the context that I had provided earlier, we could address many of these different topics. So to make things simple, we can think about the fire problem as a turbulent fluid mechanics problem, actually, with increasing orders of complexity of the boundary conditions. I did mention the embers, as you can see on the left-hand side here. embers, flowing embers getting launched and transported in the atmosphere by turbulence. So what is the nature of fire turbulence, right? We have pyrocumulus, how do they evolve, how do they move into the atmosphere? We have the problem of ecosystem atmosphere interaction, which is how vegetation, forest especially, how does it interact with the fire, and how does the disturbance propagate? And then, which is also strictly not micrometeorology, but still a fluid mechanics problem on how the fire affects the post-fire hydrology. So on the left-hand side, this is a picture from Santa Barbara, where you had in Montecito when there was a massive mudslide following the fire and there were casualties. So we want to address these kind of topics with fluid mechanics as sort of a overarching theme. All right, so how about scales? What scales do we study? And this is to provide context again. Not So on the left-hand side, we can see there are there's a picture from the Missoula Fire Science Lab, which is a very active, the leading fire research lab in US. So we can see there are lab experiments which are possible. And on the right-hand side, we can use satellite data, right? The major part of fire science is driven by state-of-the-art satellite observations. So this is from a Descartes lab showing the DNBR, the barn ratios. But on the bottom figure here, we are looking at the scales from the individual leaves to the trees to as you go up to ecoregions. And on the y-axis here on the left-hand side, we are seeing the number of constraints on the problem. And on the right-hand side, we are plotting complexity. So this is a figure adapted from the textbook, The Landscape Ecology of Fire by Mackenzie, Miller, and Falk. So what it suggests is that when you are at the smallest scales, like you are in the, let's say, a fire lab, and when you are at the largest scales, although your number of constraints increase, your complexity does actually decrease because you have good control on the problem. What's problematic is in the intermediate scales or the landscape scales, where you have heterogeneity in the orders of meters perhaps. And so when you are thinking about how does a fire climb up individual trees in a forest, and how does a fire move in a complex topography where there are patchy vegetation like this, these are scales that you cannot study in a lab. These are scales this is hard to also study from a satellite observation because they're not that big from a satellite point of view. So these are the landscape scales, the intermediate scales, where the complexity is pretty high because there are just too many number of factors interacting with each other. And these are the scales that we focus on in our groups mostly, because we can then bring in our models of atmospheric boundary layer dynamics, etc., to understand these scales essentially. All right, and again, to provide some more context, we could think about this whole thing as a problem of ERS, the energy regulation and scale. Again, this is a term borrowed from Mackenzie's and Miller's and Falk's textbook. So the idea is that, vegetation, as they're growing, they're storing energy and they're modulating the carbon and the water cycles. So you have a storage of energy, and then you have a regulation of how that energy is getting released when there is a wildfire. So you have fuel, weather, and the topography, and the turbulence and wind flow. They are sort of controlling that, or they're regulating that energy release. And then we are having this energy release happening at multiple scales because combustion is happening at the smallest scales, right? And then you have precipitation, seasonality that are happening at much larger scales. And then you have ecosystem succession happening at even larger scales. So wildfire as a problem. So I do teach a graduate class on wildfires at UC. I just started this year. And so when this is a slide that I also start with when teaching that course, because we need to understand how all these things hang together. So we have the very small scale phenomena and a very large scale phenomena happening at the same time when there's a wildfire. So, and I think this helps to contextualize the problem and then focus on our individual scales that we want to work in. So again, just a takeaway here, the scales are important, and it is important to understand which scales we are trying to solve and how scales in one particular process can interact with other scales. All right, so now coming to specifically for today's topic, and we will be talking about a few different problems. For example, fuel arrangement, the topic of fuel arrangement, the topic of fuel management, which is a major issue these days. We have the effects of complex topography. we'll discuss the flame dynamics, the role of turbulence in fire behavior, and also the topic of prescribed fires. And to address most of these topics, we'll use a code called FIRETEC that is out of Los Alamos National Lab. So before going to the individual problems, I also want to give a quick background into FIRETEC. So as we know, fire behavior is modeled by fuel, weather, and topography, of course. And here is a schematic cartoon diagram on what are the processes that we want to resolve. So we recognize that whenever there is a flame front, there is some buoyancy driven flow, right? And there is some hot gases that are going all around, so it's turbulent. And it is creating some convective preheating of the fuel elements downstream. Let's say there's an ambient air here from left to right. So you have this convective heating, but then at the same time, you're drawing in cold air from the surroundings. So you do have convective cooling as well. And then we also have some radiation. So we want to capture all these different processes through a physics-based model. In this case, it is FIRETEC. But FIRETEC is not the only model. Of course, there are WFTS from NIST and the Forest Service, and there are FIRESTAR. So there are some other models as well. But the difference between these models and the more operational models out of the Forest Service, like FLAM-MAP, is that they employ parameterized versions of these processes, whereas here we are resolving these processes and we are writing differential equations to solve these processes. And to do that, we can capture the three-dimensional heterogeneities of the fuel landscape. So we put them in grids, in numerical grids, of course, as you can see in this picture, and we solve the differential equations for these individual grids. And so we apply the techniques of computational fluid mechanics. In doing this process, we want to say that we are explicitly resolving some process, and below a certain scale, which is the resolution of this computational grid, we cannot, below these particular scales, we cannot solve everything. So we have to parameterize the processes. For example, the fine scale mixing and the chemistry and the combustion we are parameterizing, and we call them the subgrid scale parameterizations. What we are explicitly resolving through this computational framework is the wind response to topography, the wind interaction to the macro scale vegetation features. For example, not only how does the fire interact with the vegetation, but what happens if you have a gap between the two vegetation, and how the change in the configuration of this gap can change fire behavior dramatically, as we'll see later on, and also buoyancy induced flows. So here I have a range of equations. I will not go through this right now, but just know that we are essentially solving some budget equations for dry fuel, budget equations for fuel moisture, some budget equations for the internal energy of the fuel. Then we write the Navier-Stokes equation for mass momentum conservation and the potential temperature of the gas. And then you also track the oxygen. So these are complex equations. We are solving the compressible version of the Navier-Stokes. So computationally, these need the supercomputers. And as we like to joke, that these are actually slower than the actual FIRETEC as a code is slower. It takes more time to simulate a fire than it actually takes. So there is a need for coming up with also physics-based model, maybe hybrid models, which will be also faster. So it should be taken as a research tool, not as an operational tool, just a note of caution. Okay, so now coming to the fun stuff. So sharing the results on fuel arrangement. So this one, the motivation was the Thomas fire to begin with. And as you can see here, these are the fire perimeter, and these green dots here are actually avocado farms. And as you can see, there are some pictures of burned avocados. So this is a image released by the California Avocado Commission. And the idea was the fire was actually stopping mostly by the perimeters of these orchards. So then, and also the idea being that the orchards could provide defensible spaces for firefighting. Now, as a millennial living in California, if burnt avocados are not motivation enough, we have the practice of silviculture. So, plantations, arranged plantations of different types of species. These are a silvicultural procedure. And these are often, this kind of fuel treatments, like in rows and columns, are often used for economical resource extraction perspectives. So the question was, how does a fire behave if you have, so we asked this general question, how does a fire behave if you have these different types of arrangement of the vegetation, like in rows and columns? So to do that, we have to go back to the fundamental physics of how does a flame move in a bed of vegetation on trees. So this is a paper by Tom Beer from the CSIRO in Australia from 1990. So Tom Beer's paper, The Interaction of Wind and Fire, they provided this very nice little experiment where they had an ambient airflow and they created a fuel bed out of matchsticks. So as you can see, there is some flame and there's some smoke here, but it's not a wall of flame. So it changed some paradigms that the flame, when it moves through a bed of vegetation, it does not move like a solid wall, but rather it is strong. It has a strong functional dependence on the vertical wind speeds, and then we draw from our understanding of turbulent flow inside vegetation canopies, which is that there are indeed different types of eddy structures. So eddies are turbulent motions, the circular motions, and if depending on where you are inside a canopy, you might have some von Karman vortices, you have some Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities, you have a mixing layer, and then on top you have the boundary layer. So it's a superimposition of all these different eddy structures. And then on top of that, we do have sweep and ejection type motions, which are, let's say, non-local structures that are coming in inside the canopy. They're exchanging mass and momentum. So bottom line, if we forget all of that stuff, that the turbulence is important and how these different eddy structures move around inside the vegetation canopy, that influences fire behavior. That's the main takeaway from all that discussion. So with that context, we'll be looking at some observables like burnt area, burnt intensity, rate of spread, and we'll use drivers such as wind speed, vorticity, and turbulence to understand the fire behavior. So here are some results. This is FIRETEC simulations. This is a fuel data from Flagstaff with Ponderosa pine fuels. And we are seeing the fire behavior for the same amount of time where we have done different types of fuel treatments, the wind speed being from left to right. And I will go back and start this once more. So as you can see, this is a control case in the middle. And for the other scenarios, we have an along wind cuts, we have crosswind cuts, we have diagonal cuts. Then we just had the same arrangement, but then we changed the spacing, we doubled the spacing. So as you can see, entirely different fire behavior after 520 seconds. In this case, it's still going. In this case, it is an equally large burnt area, but in these cases, the fire behavior is very, very different. And these are not imaginary scenarios. These are very standard silvicultural practices especially in the Southeast. And these diagonal cuts, these are different types of fuel treatment methods that are also done in practice. So why does it happen? So to understand, we wanted to look at the wind patterns. So now we are looking into the screen as the fire is coming towards us. And here you are seeing the wind vectors. And as you can see, there are these counter rotational vortices that are popping up at the two flanks of the fire. And again, these are four different types of fuel scenarios. We have channels along the wind, we have across wind channels, and here we have done some small thinnings, right? We have created some small patches here and there. So I will run them again. As you can see here, as the fire is progressing, there is a perturbation in the wind field. There is a significant cross flow towards the fire as well, although the main wind flow is from this to this side. And so these counter rotational vortices are sort of the engines that sort of keep the fire going. And as you can see here, if you have different types of vegetation scenario, the vegetation is exerting drag force on this wind flow. And if you have also along wind channels, it is enhancing the ambient wind speed along these channels. So how this heterogeneous fuel is modulating the wind, both the along wind and the cross flow wind component is crucial to explain the fire behavior in this case. So these counter rotating vortices are actually very similar to what you see in a wingtip of an aircraft as well. And I have a clearer picture here. So if you just take one and zoom up, as you can see, these are the streamlines. And you can see this vertical structure, but this is actually not two-dimensional, this is three-dimensional. So you have sort of this helical corkscrew pattern that is present. And of course, if you create different types of channels, different types of heterogeneities in the vegetation, you would have very different fire behavior because you are just changing the wind essentially. All right, so how about the other metrics of the fire? So again, these are four different fuel arrangements. And here on the top figure, we are plotting the intensity. On the bottom figure, we are plotting the location of the fire front. The red one is where you have the uniform along wind cuts. And as you can see here, the most intense fire is the fastest one. So it has also the fastest rate of spread and the fuel intensity, which is energy per meter per second. And the other cases, we have lower and lower intensity and rate of spread. So you could be prompted to conclude that the faster fires are also more intense, right? But we would be wrong because there is no single rule in this type of scenarios. What happens is there is another quick experiment where we had an actual fire line in an actual forest, and then we had thinned out the forest, right? And as you can see, after the same amount of time, the fire has actually reached farther. So we have plotted the fire intensity and we have plotted the rate of spread. Turns out that the actual forest, because there is much more fuel, the fire intensity is higher. And what happens if you thin the forest? You have lower fuel to start with, so you have a lower intense city fire, but then your rate of spread has increased. So in your thin forest, so which is interesting, right? Now, if you are a fire manager, a land manager, if you have a sensitive structure at this location, in both cases, you might be actually in a worse scenario if you have done thinning to prepare for this fire, because if you wouldn't have much of a response time. The question is that I mean, and it's not to give any policy implications here, but just to say that the wind should be taken very seriously. That's sort of the message I want to give here, that the channels of winds are important. If you and there is no silver bullet when it comes to forest treatment. And the crosswind components are pretty important, not only the along wind components which drives the fire. And the effects of canopy drag and is important. And of course, there is no finite relationship between fire intensity and spread rate because wind can take over sometimes. And so this is an open question. Then how do you what does it mean for fire management? Do you optimize your rate of spread or do you optimize intensity? So food for thought. All right, so now let's go to the second topic, which is the effect of fuel management. So this paper was just published actually last week in scientific reports. So what we wanted to understand using FIRETEC simulation is the effect of mid-story fuel management. So the data is from the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And when we have two different scenarios, actually three scenarios, where we have a cleaned mid-story, as you can see on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you have a much denser mid-story. And then there is an intermediate stage where there is a mid-story is pretty sparse. So, and we did the simulations in two different seasons where the fuel was pretty dry and then the fuel was much more moist. So there are some interesting things. It turns out that in the dry scenario, there is some competition between the drag effects and the fuel effects, the fuel availability and the wind speed. So for example, if you consider the dense mid-story case and the dry scenario, you have a pretty big fire burnt area, burn scar. On the left hand side, you have also a pretty similar burn scar, although there is no mid story here. Turns out if you have a sparse mid story, you have actually a lower amount of like a smaller burnt area. What's happening here? So in the dense case, we have enough fuel. So the presence of fuel is enough to carry the fire forward, right? But in the no mid story scenario, your wind speed has increased because just there is less amount of fuel drag. The wind speed has increased and it has carried the fire forward. So there seems to be this competition. But if you are in an optimal level where your wind speed is also a little lower and your fuel is also a little lower, then you end up sort of in a sparse scenario where you are ending up with a lower amount of burn scar. But if you are in a dense, like if you are in the moist scenario, this sort of competition disappears, and in the no mid-story case, it's actually becomes wind driven. So then if the more the wind speed, the larger the burnt area. What about the energetics, right? How much energy does the fire release? So to do that, we sort of placed a virtual sensor in the middle of our domain in this location. And so instead of all the cases, let's just focus on these two cases where the black line is your dry, no mid-story scenario, and the blue line is your dry, dense mid-story. Sorry, not this one, the dry, dense mid-story. This is blue line, that's the black line. So and we are recording the sensible heat flux, just the amount of heat flux that that somebody would feel at a 3-meter height and as at 15-meter height, and we're tracking that pulse as time progresses. So as the fire reaches that point, we can see at 3-meter height the heat pulse at both the no mid-story case um, and the dry should be actually dense. There's a typo here. In the both the dense mid-story and the no mid-story case, the heat flux is almost the same, but at 15-meter height, uh, the dry dense mid-story case is actually experiencing a much almost double amount of sensible heat flux. So for the dry dense mid-story, crowning might happen, and if not, the heat from the below might be enough to kill the trees without burning them. So both of these scenarios are possible. Here is a picture from Northern California where some of the trees are remaining, but they're completely damaged, but they're not fully consumed. All right, so the turns out the forest thinning is the effect of forest thinning and on fire behavior is a very fascinating topic, and we just published another paper on this topic, but this time not on mid-story thinning, but let's say percentage thinning. So what we did was, so this is a paper came out in the journal Forests a couple of months ago. What we did was we had a reference case, we started a fire, then we essentially did a systematic thinning. We first did a 25% thinning, 50% thinning, and a 75% thinning. And then what we did was we kept the moisture level the same in the bottom axis here, in the vertical axis. And on the right hand axis here, we also made the fuel drier. And so turns out that the literature is divided on this topic. So there have been a number of papers which have said that if you do a thinning operation on a forest, because there are much more wind and then there are more sunlight that can infiltrate the forest fuel might become drier. And but how much drier, that's not very well understood. So the studies range, the studies that are available in the current literature, they report a pretty wide range of outcomes. They also report a wide range of fuel moisture. So some studies have indicated there is no change because the system can equilibrate itself if in certain cases. So in that case, we would be on the bottom axis, on the vertical axis, where we are not changing this, not changing the canopy moisture. And on the right hand side, so we generated these two theoretical extremes where so we are only changing the canopy moisture here, but we are saying that it would be also proportionally lower. But it is an extreme scenario, it would not happen that much, we know. But then we can say that actual fire behavior would be somewhere in the middle. It will be probably more towards this side though. So, so just to understand what sort of behavior is possible. And there have been a lot of discussion on whether by doing this thinning, you are entraining more wind, you can make the forest more drier in certain scenarios, then what happens for fire behavior, right? So here is an evidence that doing thinning by at least a larger amount of thinning, like 50% or 75% thinning, you do increase your wind speed. So at canopy height, we are plotting the wind speed. More red means higher wind speeds. So at 75% thinning, you do have higher wind speeds. But how about the rate of spread? So if you do not change your moisture content, you still see an increase of rate of spread with thinning. But if you increase your moisture, the more thinning you have, you actually do see a higher rate of spread. But how about the heat flux from below, just like the previous case? If you have no moisture change with thinning, you can see at 25% thinning level, you still see the same amount of heat flux. Although at 50% and 75% thinning, the heat flux at a certain height, at the canopy height, is much less. But if you actually have a more drier forest with thinning, So what happens is the red line is 25% thinning here, and you actually end up a much more intense fire behavior, which is kind of counterintuitive and interesting to think about. So under certain levels of thinning, if you make it too dry, you can end up getting more intense fire behavior. At least the simulations are telling us this, and there seems to be some critical level below which you would see a reduction in fire intensity. But again, we are stuck in that problem in a sense. We do not know how much of a micrometeorological response would be there, because we do not know yet how much of canopy moisture change will be there with a certain proportion of thinning. So just the takeaway here is that with more dryness, the fires in the thin forest record higher energy release. So takeaway here that the stages of management are again they are natural phases of the forest. So when you are doing a thinning operation is important, the seasonality is important, and also remember in many forests you have to optimize your fire goals with biodiversity goals and grazing and logging goals. So sometimes they might be against each other, so you have to optimize that. And then effects of thinning are also sensitive to, this is really important, the micrometeorological changes in the canopy. So I think as boundary layer meteorologists, we can make some more progress in this direction, but this is just an initial start. All right, so I see there are some questions popping up, but I will look at them at the end of the presentation if it is okay, but please keep sending those. Um, so let's look at the next topic, which is the turbulent fluid flow. And this is not with FIRETEC, these are based on experimental observations. And this is a picture of the fire flux experiment conducted by, led by San Jose State University, Craig Clemens Group, and the US Forest Service. So it was a small prescribed fire in Texas, and they had a vertical tower with eddy covariance measurements, which are sampling velocity, temperature, etc. at pretty 20, 30 hertz time resolution. And that allows us to study the turbulent processes. And the question we can answer is how does, as we know, fire generates weather, how is that different from regular atmospheric flows, right? So here's just a snapshot of how the time series of the three different velocity components, the U, V, and the W, which is the longitudinal cross flow and the vertical velocity components, how do they look like? And as you can see, as the fire reaches the sensors, you do see certain spikes in the time series. This is most evident, of course, in the temperature. Okay, so here's a little involved result, but this is interesting, so I want to put it up here, which is we do see some very interesting phenomena on the nature of the fire wind. So to understand that, we calculate the momentum flux, which is sort of a covariance between the fluctuations of longitudinal velocity and the fluctuations in the vertical velocity. And we do a standard technique in micrometeorology, which is called the quadrant analysis. Essentially, what we do is we partition the fluxes based on their signs into 4 different components. So without going to the details, all we need to know for now is the sweep events are downward drafts of high momentum air. Ejection is upward fluxes of low momentum air. Then you have outward interaction, which is upward drafts of high momentum air, and then inward interaction, which is downward flux of low momentum air. And the signs are, as you can see, U prime is the longitudinal velocity fluctuation, W prime is the vertical velocity fluctuations. So, and once we know the sweep, ejection, inward and outward interaction events, we are collecting them, and we are plotting them for the momentum, the turbulent momentum, for before the fire, which is pre-FFP, is before pre-fire front propagation. So for the time period where the sensor is pretty far away from the fire front, the FFP is where about 6 minutes or so where the fire is crossing that sensor, the tower, at 4 different heights. And then we have the post FFP, which is the post fire front propagation. So we are plotting these 4 different components at 4 different heights: 2 meter, 10 meter, 28 meter, and 42 meter. There's a lot of things to take away from here. I will just request you to focus on this part, and we can only focus on the red bar here, which is the sweep. So sweep is downward drafts of high momentum air, right? And so notice that, so let's take a step back and think for a moment. When it is a fire environment, you would expect it's hot gases going upward, right? It's actually not so. It's not all updrafts. So here's the key message here. It is not all updrafts. And at 2 meter height, you have a strong sweep. The strongest momentum component is actually from sweep, which is the downdraft motion of high momentum air before the fires is coming to the sensor. Now, during the fire front propagation, not only 2 meter at 2 meter height, even at 10 meter height, you have the sweep gaining over the other components of the flux. So it allows us to understand which part of the turbulence is doing what, and then it allows us to come up with better fire behavior models. So the sweep gets stronger, which is again very counterintuitive because you'd expect the upward motions to be most strong, right? But again, upward motions are coupled with downward motions as well, as we'll see later on. But again, after the fire has passed, it has reduced back to its pre-fire values. So this is an interesting result. And also we are interested to understand the intermittency, which is how there seems to be a bursting phenomena at which the fire is hitting the fuel elements at a particular location. And by bursting, that means it's not a constant process, but it happens like individual sporadic bursts. And this was identified by Mark Finney in a PNAS paper in 2015. So to understand that, I will not go into the details, it's a little involved, but we did something called a traffic approximation where we just looked at instead of the amplitude, we just looked at the phase of the time series. It looks like a barcode, and we calculated something which called clustering exponent or intermittency exponent, which essentially means how the eddies are clustered together or separated together. And what it means, if you have a high amount of clustering, that means it could mean more dust particles and soot particles joining together, and more, has implications in air quality, for example. So we did find out, I'll just mention the takeaway here, is that the fire front propagation actually increases the intermittency. So if you have more questions, I can address that, but for now I will just skim over this topic. So I want to mention that these type of experiments are important for benchmarking of simulations. We are developing these fire behavior models. Of course, we need to understand how good are they and how do they, how do they tally when we are comparing it with actual field conditions. By this intermittency type analysis, we can characterize the sources for CO2 hydrocarbons. And we can also ask the question, how can we apply the standard tools of turbulent fluid mechanics, which is very developed since the last hundreds years? How can we apply that to fire dynamics? And the amount of turbulence in the air is important for smoke dispersion, ember dispersion, even seed dispersion. And so by seed dispersion, it's also important for biodiversity. And it can also allow us to characterize the fire wind. So that's how this type of analysis are, although it's a little more involved and complicated than the previous studies. This is interesting. So the next topic is complex topography. And as we know, especially for California, it's very rugged, obviously. And so we are trying to understand how does fire move up and down complex topographies. So for example, here are two different scenarios where the fuel data is actually from Colorado. And then we change the complexity of the landscape. So a landscape can be defined by many ways. One is, of course, the slope aspect, but here is, we computed something called rugosity, which is how complicated is the surface itself is. And we made them larger and trying to see fire behavior. As you can see here, the fire has changed in terms of its rate of spread, and also it has changed its shape drastically. And to understand the context, we are essentially plotting the wind. And as you can see here, very different wind patterns because of, so the bottom line again here is that topography influences airflow. It generates local scale circulations, and that can modify fire behavior. We're also plotting upslope and downslope fires. And the red line, which is downslope fire, it's confirming to our general understanding that the fire can move faster on downslopes compared to upslopes. So why do we study this, right? So one important thing is, this general understanding that the fire moves faster upstream. It essentially provides defensible spaces in firefighting, but in certain cases, there have been findings that the fire did go pretty fast essentially down slopes. And that has also created firefighter fatalities, as you can see from this quotation here in the South Canyon fire of 1994, which killed 14 firefighters, because this type of surprise behavior can take firefighters by in unexpected scenarios. So we want to understand under what scenarios fires can move upstream, upslope and downslopes. And also from an academic perspective, when we are thinking about global fire predictions, turns out that the problem areas are complex topography. So there is a lot of uncertainties in. So this is a picture from the global fire emissions database, and the most tricky areas to predict fire behavior are areas with complex topography, because we have just too many uncertainties in understanding fire behavior in those locations. All right, so coming to the next topic, which was flame dynamics. And again, this is a new paper, also made the cover story in Atmosphere. So this is to understand how does the fire move again, and this is to corroborate a schematic picture that Mark Finney had provided in his 2015 PNAS paper. The idea being that fires move as a series of coherent structures, which are sort of like fingers, and they're called towers and troughs. And the idea is there are these towers, which are the updraft regions, and there are these in between these towers, we have these troughs, right, which are actually rich in oxygen, and they are in these locations where there are these bursting processes actually happening that are convectively heating the fuel elements. So we did some simulations with FIRETEC to see if we can see if we can quantify these type of structures, and we can see that, as you can see, these finger type structures which are present for a long time. And this is simulation from Los Alamos, where you can see the three-dimensional structure of these fingers as well. And turns out that these structures also have a certain dependence to the fuel periodicity. So if you change the periodicity of the fuel by treating them, you end up with different types of structures. So this is not published yet, but we want to understand how fuel properties and how the atmospheric conditions can influence these coherent features. And then, can there be, does this have any implication on firefighting? Can we like cool down these areas, and then perhaps it might change how the fire can move, like if you are suppressing the trough regions between the towers, which are oxygen rich, that might hinder the fire to go forward. So these are sort of the implication when studying these features. And I also want to mention prescribed fires. So this is actually a large project that we are starting, but I want to mention what aspects are we studying first. So we are studying different types of ignition features. Again, these are simulations not from my group, but from at least this particular simulation is from Los Alamos. And we are looking at aerial ignition, which are essentially ignited spheres dropped from helicopters like this, and it can create different types of burn patterns and different types of smokes. So we're interested in studying this type of ignition patterns, and also we can simulate, let's say, ignition lines with ATVs. I'll kind of make it fast. You can also see it here. We're creating these ATV ignition lines and see how the fire can propagate in the landscape. So, and also we're interested in simulating the interaction between multiple fires. So we have a backfire coming here as a standard operating tool, and then we have another fire on the left-hand side. So how does the wind from one fire is influencing another fire? We don't know yet. So these are things that we are just starting to study as part of big, I will mention that project first. So it's a UC multi-campus national lab collaborative projects. And we have started this project a few months ago. And so it's a 3-year project aimed at transforming, it's a strong word, but to develop tools and decision support systems for doing more prescribed fires in California where it is needed, of course. And so as a initial part of that study, I just want to mention this campaign that our postdoc, Dr. Janine Boyjanat-Radino, did a couple of weeks ago, actually, in the creek fire. is happening in Fresno. Correct me if I'm wrong, Janine. So in this particular case, we can see a fuel break. That was a shaded fuel break actually. And so by the way, this is the creek fire location. It was completely burnt out. You can see the smoke in the valley. And but this is a fuel break where they did some prescribed burns and did some fuel treatments. And they did pile burning actually, where they collected all that material and then burned them in different piles. And this is a drone footage that Janine took where we could see that the fire has essentially burned completely before it had hit the fuel break. But during in the fuel break, it was successful in reducing the fire intensity, and the canopy is still intact. But after the fuel break, it picked up again for a little bit. So fuel breaks and fuel treatment areas, as you can see, are pretty interesting, and there's a lot more to learn. So we will be focusing a lot in the coming days in this problem. So I want to summarize everything, and just to mention that, even from a micrometeorological perspective, when you study fires, there are a lot we can study. If you are from a firefighting perspective, we can study burnt area, burnt intensity, rate of spread, defensible spaces, post-fire hazards. If you are a land manager, we're looking at the predisposition of the landscape that can lead to fires, also fuel treatments, prescribed burns, resource extraction, air quality. And if you are just from a science perspective, the landscape ecology of the fire, representation of fires in Earth system models, how to characterize fuels, and how do we just build multi-fidelity fire models. These are all interesting questions, and we are touching the tip of these icebergs in our limited ways. But these questions, they're not in isolation. They are all influencing each other. And if there is only one takeaway that you want to take home from this presentation, is that the models can help. And although models can help to idealize some particular scenarios, um, and sometimes you do have to take them with a grain of salt, but it can help you understand the limits of fire behavior, and then you can zero in on a problem. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much for your talk, Tirtha, and it was really great to see the collaborations across California and across the country, and using experiments and simulations together. So we have a bunch of questions already, and I encourage anyone who has questions to include them in the chat. I'm going to start. There's two questions kind of together. One is by Hans Johansson and another by Kathy Butler from NIST. And they're sort of together asking about the inclusion of embers or firebrand transport. And if you have thoughts on including it in your models, and whether it is, how you treat that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks for this. FIRETEC does have a spotting capability. It's still under development. So I know, Michael, yourself, you do a lot of work on ember. I've seen your papers on ember depositions, but then there are three parts of the problem. One is ember generation, the second part is ember transport, and the third part is deposition. The deposition part is less understood, and it needs some material science understanding on how the structures ignite. But with FIRETEC, what we are starting to do is to include the turbulence in a right way, so that at least we can predict the on an average, statistically the average of the distance that firebrands can transport. But there more work needs to be done, of course, in this area.
Thank you. And there are a few questions about thinning. And so there were questions from Brian Marella about might mid-story thinning combined with intermittently placed fire resistant sails to impede winds be an effective management practice?
Okay, let me go to slide 25. So let's end the show here, and I'll go to. Yeah, so in this case, on slide 25, I did do the moisture change sort of in an ad hoc. And I'm looking for okay, so might mid-story thinning combined with intermittently placed fire-resistant sails, effective management practice. That could be very interesting. I hadn't thought of it before. And so it is clear that the wind, if you do too much of a thinning, the increased wind can essentially, negate the thinning that you have done. So placing cells might actually take care of that. That's a really good idea. It would be interesting to chat more on this.
Thanks. And if you're interested in chatting, remember, look in the chat box. We have a link for our Zoom discussion, which will start a little after 4. So there was also a question in terms of thinning and controlling moisture content. And there was a follow-on by Marty Alexander that a canopy fuel moisture less than 70% is likely a reflection of dead conifer needles.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And this was just done to see the theoretical extremes. And I know these are not realistic, but so what we wanted to see in the literature, there is no indication on how much change would happen. So we just wanted to simulate some, the extreme envelopes and to see, where can the intermediate fire behavior can be. So I pretty agree. I agree that the actual fire behavior might be very close to this line, or there would be actually the moisture changes part with thinning would be, of course, much less than what I have done here.
Thank you. So I want to combine a few questions given the limited time we have left. And there are questions about your reduced order models. And so I'll combine several into two parts. One is, do you verify or how do you know that the subgrid scale models are accurate? And the other aspect that's came up from Zodi also here at Berkeley is, have you looked at more rapid simulation methods, either by using reduced order models or someone suggested some kind of machine learning?
Yeah, so the first question was subgrid scale models. So, we are planning some, so for example, we'll be doing this as part of this UC Lab Fees project. We'll be doing 9 prescribed burns in the coming 3 years. So one of the goal of that project was to actually validate this quick fire model with our controlled burns. And there have been some papers I've published over the years. And of course, as you know, the FASME experiment is also happening. The goal is to validate some of the fire models. So I agree there has not been enough work. I would say we need to do more in terms of model validation. And for the second part was, what was it again? For reduced, faster models. So there is another model called quick fire that we're working on, and also we'll be developing more as part of our project. But Rod Lynn at Los Alamos and Kevin Hyers and Tall Timbers, they are working on, they have a prototype already, and we are actually using it for another project, which is much faster. And it uses some phenomenological understanding from FIRETEC, and it combines it with agent-based modeling of wildfires. So those are, you can run really ensembles in matter of minutes.
Great, we're advancing a lot there. A final question, given the time. So from Andrew Johnson, could lighter fuels such as grasses in the understory also account for higher rates of spread, and more heavy fuels and unthinned stands account for slower rate of spread?
It's possible, yeah. So it also comes down to the question of the fuel heterogeneity. So remember that the lighter fuels are also not homogeneous. So there are also usually high clusters of grass and litter. And so we haven't tested that yet, but it is very likely, because there also have been some studies where they found out that the surface fuel has become more drier post thinning. So they could be also contributing more. And this is something we're working on, actually, post thinning, but changing the surface fuel moisture instead, the canopy moisture.
So it looks like we have time for one more question from Marco Deanda. What type of forest were you using when you made the number 25 graph?
Oh, this was actually, this was a ponderosa pine type forest. The original full data was from Flagstaff, yeah. And we take it as a sort of now in an almost idealized fashion, and just use it as our toy model to impose changes, because although these are computationally expensive, but much cheaper than actual field experiments. So we could do anything with the full models here.
So thank you very much for the presentation and the question and answer here. We're running out of time now. So I want to encourage you, if you would like to, please look in the chat box. We've placed a Zoom link to the follow-on discussion. Please go ahead and follow that link. Unfortunately, I see someone's raising their hand, but we can't, there's no way for me to to allow you to talk or anything, if you can chat to the window with us, and we can communicate there, or we'll see you on the other Zoom call in just a couple of minutes as we switch over. Thank you again to our support from UC Merced and Berkeley Engineering. And we've also sent some emails about the ASPRS symposium on remote sensing. Some partners, it's not affiliated with us, but it is another great symposium focused on California and remote sensing and wildfire. So thank you again for your talk, and we'll see you in a few minutes on the other call.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody.